A millionaire hired a wheelchair woman as his secretary 20 years ago. When he died, she inherited 70% of his company. His family was furious and tried to destroy her. But what this woman revealed about her connection to him left everyone absolutely speechless. This is Marina Chen's story, a tale of hidden truths, family secrets, corporate power, and discovering that sometimes the people we dismiss are the ones who matter most. Before we start the story, leave a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. We love seeing our Deep Stories community growing all around the world. And at the end of this story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Let us know what you think. If you believe that everyone deserves respect regardless of their circumstances, if you think family secrets always find their way to the surface, and if you know that kindness and loyalty are worth more than money, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is Marina Chen's journey, a story about disability, dignity, inheritance, and learning that the measure of a person has nothing to do with whether they can walk. Let's begin. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Chen Technologies was silent, except for the quiet rustling of papers and the uncomfortable shifting of expensive suits against leather chairs. Marina Chen sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table, her wheelchair positioned carefully against the edge, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, despite the exhaustion that pulled at her shoulders. She wore a dark gray suit that she'd bought specifically for this occasion, professional but not expensive, the kind of outfit that said she took this meeting seriously without pretending to be something she wasn't. The fabric was good quality but clearly off the rack, purchased at a department store rather than tailored by the exclusive designers that the other people in this room used. Her long black hair was pulled back in a neat bun at the base of her neck, secured with a simple silver clip that had belonged to her mother, and her brown eyes, usually warm and expressive when she smiled, were guarded now, watchful, preparing for whatever was about to happen in this room that suddenly felt too small and too cold. Marina's wheelchair was a state-of-the-art model, lightweight carbon fiber with custom adjustments that she'd saved for 3 years to afford. But even the best wheelchair in the world couldn't change the fact that she was the only person in this room who couldn't simply stand up and walk out if things became uncomfortable. That reality, the perpetual awareness of being physically different from everyone around her, was something Marina had lived with for 12 years, ever since the accident that had changed everything about her life when she was just 16 years old. She'd learned to navigate that reality with grace and determination, but it never stopped being exhausting, never stopped requiring a level of mental energy that people who could walk would never have to expend. Across from her sat 3 people who looked at her with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed hostility, and Marina could read the thoughts behind their eyes as clearly as if they'd spoken them aloud. What is she doing here? Why is the secretary at the table with the family? This is inappropriate. This is uncomfortable. Why did Richard insist she had to be present? Marina had seen those expressions before, hundreds of times over her 20 years working at Chen Technologies, the subtle double-take when people realized she used a wheelchair, the momentary confusion about how to interact with her, the uncomfortable overcompensation or the equally uncomfortable avoidance. She'd learned to ignore it, to focus on her work and let her competence speak louder than people's prejudices. But in this moment, with everything feeling so uncertain and strange, it was harder to maintain that professional detachment. There was Marcus Chen, 45 years old, the eldest son of Thomas Chen, wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that probably cost somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000 if Marina's estimation was correct, and she'd gotten quite good at estimating the cost of things after 20 years of managing Thomas's expense accounts and coordinating with his personal shopper. Marcus's suit was Brioni, Italian wool with a subtle pinstripe that caught the light when he moved, paired with a crisp white shirt that had his initials monogrammed on the cuffs, and a silk tie in a deep burgundy that complemented his complexion. His shoes were John Lobb, handmade British leather that cost more than Marina's monthly rent, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the overhead lights. Everything about Marcus's appearance screamed wealth, status, and power, from his platinum Rolex to his gold cufflinks to the way he carried himself with the unconscious arrogance of someone who had never been told no, never been denied something he wanted, never had to question whether he belonged in any space he chose to occupy. Marcus's face was hard, all sharp angles and tight muscles, his jaw clenched so tightly that Marina could see the tendons standing out in his neck. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the conference room, and they were cold as they stared at Marina like she was an intruder who had somehow infiltrated a space where she didn't belong. He sat with his arms crossed over his chest, a closed, defensive posture that communicated hostility and impatience in equal measure, and his right leg bounced under the table with a nervous energy that suggested he was barely containing his desire to be anywhere else but here. Marcus had never liked Marina, had made that clear from the first day she'd started working at Chen Technologies 20 years ago, when she was just a 20-year-old college graduate desperate for a chance to prove herself in the corporate world. Marcus had been the one who'd argued most vocally against hiring her, had told his father that having a secretary in a wheelchair would be bad for the company's image, would make clients uncomfortable, would create logistical problems that weren't worth the trouble. Marina had overheard that conversation through the partially open door of Thomas's office during her second week on the job, had heard Marcus's voice raised in frustration as he demanded to know why his father was being so stubborn about this, why he couldn't just hire someone normal instead of making some kind of political statement about disability rights. Thomas had shut down that conversation quickly and firmly, had told Marcus that Marina was staying, and that if he had a problem with that, he could take it up with human resources, but the damage had been done. Marina had known from that moment that Marcus saw her as less than, as someone who had gotten her job through pity rather than merit, and nothing she had accomplished in the subsequent 2 decades had changed his mind. His wife Veronica sat beside him, a blonde woman in her early 40s with perfectly styled hair that fell in glossy waves to her shoulders, clearly the result of several hours at an expensive salon, and probably at least one stylist on staff at their home for touch-ups between appointments. Her makeup was flawless, professionally applied with the kind of subtlety that took real skill to achieve, making her look naturally beautiful rather than obviously made up. Though Marina knew from experience managing Thomas's household accounts that Veronica spent thousands of dollars a month on beauty treatments and cosmetics, she wore a cream-colored Chanel suit with the signature gold buttons and chain trim, paired with matching Chanel pumps and a quilted handbag that Marina recognized as this season's limited edition, which meant Veronica had probably paid somewhere north of $12,000 for it. Pearls circled her neck, classic and elegant, and diamond studs glittered in her ears, each stone at least 2 carats, if Marina's practiced eye was accurate. Veronica held her designer handbag clutched to her chest like a shield or a security blanket, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the leather so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, the only visible sign of tension in her otherwise carefully composed exterior. Her face was a study in practiced sympathy, the kind of expression that wealthy women learn to deploy at charity events and funerals, a mask of appropriate emotion that didn't quite reach her ice-blue eyes. Those eyes kept darting to Marina's wheelchair with poorly disguised discomfort, flicking down and then quickly away as if she couldn't quite help herself, but also didn't want to be caught staring. Marina had seen that reaction countless times before, the way people's eyes were drawn to the wheelchair, like it was some kind of fascinating horror that they couldn't look away from, but also couldn't acknowledge openly. Veronica had never spoken more than a dozen words to Marina in all the years they'd known each other, despite the fact that Marina had been responsible for coordinating many of the family events and holiday gatherings that Veronica attended. When they did interact, Veronica's tone was always carefully neutral, the way you might speak to any service worker whose name you didn't care to remember, polite enough to maintain social convention, but distant enough to make clear that Marina was not someone Veronica considered worthy of actual engagement. Marina had helped plan Veronica's surprise 40th birthday party 2 years ago, had coordinated with caterers and florists and venue managers, had worked late into the night making sure every detail was perfect, and Veronica had thanked her with a vague nod and a comment to Thomas about how nice it was to have staff who knew how to follow instructions. Marina had smiled and said thank you and gone home that night feeling the particular kind of invisible that came from being treated as a function rather than a person. And then there was Jennifer Chen, 38 years old, Thomas's daughter, sitting a little apart from her brother and sister-in-law, creating a subtle physical distance that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable being grouped with them, or perhaps wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation they found themselves in. Jennifer wore a burgundy wrap dress that was expensive but understated, probably DVF or something similar, paired with simple black heels and minimal jewelry, just a watch and a pair of small earrings. Her brown hair was cut in a shoulder-length bob, professionally styled but not overly fussed with, and her makeup was light, natural, the look of someone who put effort into her appearance without being consumed by it. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her fingers twisted together in a way that revealed her nervousness, and unlike Marcus and Veronica, she actually looked uncomfortable with the situation rather than merely angry about it. Jennifer's brown eyes kept darting between Marina and her brother, and Marina could see the internal conflict playing out on her face. The pull between family loyalty and whatever instinct was telling her that something about this situation wasn't quite what it seemed. Jennifer had always been kinder than Marcus, more willing to acknowledge Marina's existence when they passed in the hallways or encountered each other at company events. She'd made small talk occasionally, asked Marina about her weekend or complimented her outfit, the kind of basic courtesy that shouldn't have stood out but did in comparison to Marcus's open hostility and most other executives' complete indifference. Marina had always appreciated those small gestures, had seen them as evidence that Jennifer was fundamentally decent, even if she'd been raised in a bubble of privilege that made it hard for her to fully understand the experiences of people who weren't wealthy and connected. But appreciation for basic courtesy didn't mean Marina knew Jennifer well or had any real sense of who she was beyond the surface-level persona she presented at company events. Jennifer was Thomas Chen's daughter, Marcus Chen's younger sister, part of the family that owned and controlled Chen Technologies, and Marina was the secretary, the assistant, the person who managed schedules and coordinated meetings and made sure the important people's lives ran smoothly. There was a gulf between them that went beyond the difference in their wealth or social position, a fundamental disconnect in how they moved through the world and what they expected from it. Jennifer had never worked for anything she had been born into wealth and privilege and opportunity, while Marina had fought for every single thing she'd achieved, had overcome obstacles that Jennifer probably couldn't even imagine. That difference created a barrier that all the polite small talk in the world couldn't bridge. At the head of the table sat Richard Morrison, the family attorney, a man in his 60s with silver hair that had been carefully styled to look casually elegant, the kind of purposefully rumpled sophistication that took a good barber and expensive products to achieve. He wore wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, designer frames that were subtle enough not to draw attention, but expensive enough that anyone who knew about such things would recognize them as high-end. His suit was charcoal gray, likely Armani or Hugo Boss based on the cut and drape, paired with a burgundy tie that picked up the color in Jennifer's dress, probably not a coincidence since Richard was known for being observant about such details. His shoes were Bruno Magli, Italian leather polished to a soft gleam, and his watch was an understated Patek Philippe that cost more than most people's cars. Richard had the kind of face that had delivered both good news and devastating news to wealthy families for 4 decades, weathered and distinguished in the way that successful men of a certain age were allowed to be, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of wisdom and experience rather than age. His expression was professionally neutral, the blank mask that lawyers learned to adopt when they needed to maintain emotional distance from difficult situations, but Marina could see tension in the set of his shoulders. in the way his fingers drummed lightly against the leather folder in front of him, in the way he kept adjusting his glasses even though they didn't need adjusting. He knew what was in that folder. He knew what was about to happen. And he clearly wasn't looking forward to it, which made Marina's anxiety spike even higher, because if Richard Morrison, who had probably handled hundreds of difficult estate situations over his long career, was nervous about this meeting, then whatever was coming was going to be bad. Marina had known Richard for 20 years, had worked with him on countless legal matters related to Thomas's business and personal affairs, had coordinated meetings and phone calls and document reviews, had even had lunch with him a few times when they'd needed to discuss complex scheduling issues. He'd always been professional and courteous with her, had never treated her as less than because of her wheelchair or her position, had seemed to genuinely respect her competence and intelligence. But in all those years, Marina had never seen him look quite this uncomfortable, quite this reluctant to proceed with whatever task he'd been assigned. It made her stomach clench with anxiety, made her grip the armrests of her wheelchair a little tighter, made her mentally prepare herself for news that she couldn't even begin to imagine. Richard cleared his throat, the sound loud in the silent room, and adjusted his reading glasses for what must have been the 5th time in as many minutes. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the leather folder in front of him, revealing several documents bound with blue backing, the kind of official legal paperwork that represented hours of attorney time at rates that made Marina's head spin when she'd had to coordinate billing for Thomas's various legal matters. The top document was clearly a will. She could see that much from the formatting and the official seals. And there were multiple copies stacked beneath it, probably one for each person present at this meeting. Richard began to speak in the measured tone of someone who knew the words he was about to say would detonate like a bomb in the middle of this family, someone who was trying to maintain professional distance even as he delivered news that would fundamentally alter the lives of everyone in the room. Thank you all for coming today. I know this has been a difficult time for everyone. Thomas's death was sudden and unexpected, and I know you're all still grieving. I want you to know that I've been Thomas's friend as well as his attorney for over 20 years, and his loss is deeply felt by everyone who knew him. He was a remarkable man who built something extraordinary, and his absence leaves a void that will be difficult to fill. The words were standard condolence phrasing, the kind of thing attorneys said at will readings, to acknowledge the emotional weight of the occasion while also trying to transition into the business at hand. Marina had heard similar sentiments at her mother's funeral 12 years ago, well-meaning words from people who barely knew her mother but felt obligated to say something comforting. They'd felt hollow then, and they felt hollow now, though she knew Richard meant them sincerely enough. Thomas Chen had been many things to many people, and his death had created ripples that extended far beyond this conference room and the people gathered in it. Richard continued, his voice steady but with an underlying tension that Marina could hear even if the others might not. As you know, we're here today for the reading of Thomas Chen's last will and testament. Thomas was very specific in his wishes, and as his attorney for over 20 years, I can assure you that this document represents his true intentions, made while he was of sound mind and body. He updated this will 6 months ago after extensive consultation with myself and 2 other attorneys to ensure that every detail was legally sound and would withstand any potential challenges. He wanted there to be absolutely no question about his mental capacity or his intentions when this document was executed. That last sentence hung in the air, heavy with implication. Why would Thomas have been concerned about challenges to his will? Why would he have needed 3 attorneys to review it for soundness? Those questions created a sense of foreboding in Marina's chest, a growing certainty that whatever was coming was going to be complicated and difficult and probably painful for everyone involved. She glanced at Marcus and saw that his expression had shifted slightly from impatience to something more alert, more focused, as if he too had caught the significance of Richard's careful phrasing. Richard pulled out the top document and set it in front of him, his hands resting on either side of it as if he needed to physically anchor himself before continuing. Thomas Chen's estate is valued at approximately $350 million. This includes his 70% ownership stake in Chen Technologies, which, based on the most recent valuation, is worth approximately $240 million, as well as extensive real estate holdings, including the primary family estate in Pacific Heights, the vacation home in Aspen, the beachfront property in Malibu, a condominium in Manhattan, and several investment properties. There are also substantial investment portfolios managed by Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and several other firms, an extensive art collection that includes works by Rothko, Pollock, and several contemporary artists, a collection of vintage automobiles, and various other assets including life insurance policies and retirement accounts. Marina's mind struggled to process those numbers. $350 million. She couldn't even conceptualize that amount of wealth. She'd been working for 20 years and had managed to save about $200,000 through careful budgeting and taking advantage of the company's retirement matching program. That felt like a significant nest egg to her, enough to feel some financial security even though she knew it wasn't nearly enough to retire on. But $350 million was a number so large it became almost abstract, impossible to relate to any lived experience she'd ever had. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his impatience returning now that they were getting to the actual numbers, his knee bouncing more rapidly under the table in a way that made his expensive suit jacket shift and wrinkle slightly. Yes, we know all this, Richard. Father's accountants gave us the preliminary valuation weeks ago. Can we please get to the distribution? I have a board meeting at 3 o'clock, and I need time to prepare for taking over as CEO. There are decisions that need to be made immediately, transitions that need to happen, and I can't do any of that until this formality is completed. His tone was dismissive, almost bored. The tone of a man who expected this to be a mere formality before he stepped into his father's shoes and claimed what he clearly believed was rightfully his. Marcus had been groomed his entire life to take over Chen Technologies, had worked in various divisions of the company since he was a teenager doing summer internships, had been promoted to VP of Operations 5 years ago, despite objections from other executives who felt he wasn't qualified for the position. Thomas had overruled those objections, had insisted that Marcus needed leadership experience to prepare him for eventually running the entire company. Though Marina had heard Thomas express private frustration about Marcus's performance more than once over the years, Richard's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been pity, or might have been apprehension, or might have been both. His lips pressed together in a thin line, and Marina saw him take a deep breath before continuing, as if steeling himself for what was coming next. Of course, Marcus. Thomas Chen's will stipulates the following distribution. To his son, Marcus Chen, he leaves 10% of his estate, approximately $35 million, along with the vacation home in Aspen, which is valued at approximately $8 million, and the collection of vintage automobiles currently housed at the estate, valued at approximately $6 million. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Marcus's face went from impatient to confused in an instant, his brow furrowing as he processed what Richard had just said. 10%. Not the 70% controlling stake in the company, not the CEO position he'd been assuming was his, just 10%. About $35 million plus some properties. A fortune by any reasonable standard, but not what he'd been expecting, not even close to what he'd been expecting. Wait. Marcus's voice was tight, controlled, but with an edge of something dangerous underneath. Wait just a moment. 10%. That's only... What about the rest? What about the company? What about the controlling stake? What about the CEO position? His knee had stopped bouncing. He sat very still now, very focused, his entire attention fixed on Richard with an intensity that would have been intimidating if Richard hadn't spent decades dealing with angry, wealthy people whose expectations weren't being met. Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the next page of the will, his movements deliberate and slow, giving everyone time to process what had just been revealed before moving on to the next bombshell. To his daughter, Jennifer Chen, he leaves 10% of his estate, approximately $35 million, along with the beachfront property in Malibu valued at approximately $12 million, and the art collection currently displayed in the east wing of the main house, valued at approximately $18 million. Jennifer made a small sound, not quite a gasp, but something close to it, a sharp intake of breath that spoke of shock and confusion. Her hands flew to her mouth, covering it as if she could somehow hold back the reaction she was having. She wasn't angry like Marcus, at least not yet, just profoundly shocked, her eyes wide and disbelieving as she stared at Richard like he'd just spoken in a foreign language that she couldn't quite translate. Unlike Marcus, Jennifer hadn't been expecting to inherit everything, hadn't built her identity around the assumption that she'd eventually control her father's company, but she also clearly hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared herself for only receiving 20% of the estate combined with her brother. Marina felt her own confusion and anxiety growing exponentially. 20% had been distributed to Thomas's children. What about the remaining 80%? Where was Thomas leaving the bulk of his fortune? Who was getting the company that had been his life's work for 40 years? Her mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of this. Maybe he'd left it to charity. That would be like Thomas, actually, to use his wealth to make a meaningful difference in the world rather than simply passing it on to children who already had more than enough. Or maybe he'd set up some kind of trust, a complex structure designed to ensure the company continued operating according to his vision even after his death. But Richard was looking directly at Marina now, and there was something in his expression that made her stomach clench with a new kind of anxiety. Something that went beyond confusion about Thomas's estate distribution and into the territory of personal fear about why the attorney was looking at her like that, like he was about to say something that would fundamentally alter her entire existence. His gray eyes were sympathetic, but also somehow apologetic, like he was sorry for what he was about to do even though he had no choice but to proceed. "To Marina Chen," Richard said, his voice steady but softer now, gentler, as if he understood that the words he was speaking were going to hit Marina like a physical blow. His executive secretary of 20 years, Thomas leaves 70% of his estate, including controlling interest in Chen Technologies, the primary residence in Pacific Heights, valued at approximately $35 million, the Manhattan condo, valued at approximately $8 million, and the remainder of all other asset not specifically bequeathed to other parties. This amounts to approximately $245 million in total value, along with full decision-making authority over the company's future direction, the power to appoint and remove board members, and complete control over all business operations. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. The silence in that conference room was so complete that Marina became hyper-aware of small sounds she'd never normally notice. The faint electrical hum of the overhead lights, the barely perceptible whoosh of the building's climate control system, the distant sound of traffic from the street 42 floors below, and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears like thunder, so loud she was almost surprised the others couldn't hear it. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of mistake, some clerical error that would be discovered and corrected, some bizarre mix-up of names or documents. Thomas Chen had just left her. Marina Chen, his secretary, a woman who had spent 20 years organizing his schedule and managing his correspondence and coordinating his meetings. 70% of everything he owned, $245 million. Controlling interest in a billion-dollar company, decision-making authority over 5,000 employees. This made no sense. No sense whatsoever. Why would Thomas do this? What could possibly possess him to leave his life's work, the company he'd built from nothing over 40 years, to his secretary instead of to his children? Then Marcus exploded out of his chair with such force that the heavy leather seat rolled backward across the plush carpet and slammed into the wall behind him with a crash that made everyone jump. His face had gone from confused to purple with rage in an instant, the transformation so complete and so sudden that Marina actually flinched back in her wheelchair, instinctively creating distance even though she was already at the far end of the table. The veins in Marcus's neck stood out like cords, pulsing visibly with each heartbeat, and his hands were clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles had gone white, his entire body radiating fury and something that looked almost like violence. "This is insane!" Marcus's voice came out as a roar, loud enough that Marina was certain people in adjacent offices could hear him, loud enough that his words probably carried down the hallway outside this conference room. "This is impossible! This is fraud! This is completely and totally impossible! My father would never leave his company to his secretary! She's... He gestured wildly at Marina, his arm sweeping in her direction, and though he didn't finish the sentence, didn't actually say the words. The implication was clear and cruel, hanging in the air like poison. She's just a secretary. She's disabled. She's in a wheelchair. She's nobody. She's nothing. How could someone like her possibly deserve what should belong to him? Marina had heard variations of that sentiment her entire adult life, had faced that prejudice in job interviews and performance reviews and casual interactions with colleagues who couldn't see past her wheelchair to the person underneath. But hearing it now, in this context, with so much at stake, made it cut deeper than usual, made it feel like a physical wound even though Marcus hadn't actually said the words out loud. Veronica stood as well, moving to stand beside her husband, her designer handbag still clutched to her chest like armor, like she could somehow protect herself from this incomprehensible reality through sheer force of will and expensive accessories. Her perfectly made-up face had gone from practicing sympathy to twisted with fury, her ice-blue eyes narrowed to slits, her mouth pulled into a snarl that destroyed the carefully constructed beauty of her professional makeup. This is obviously fraud. She must have manipulated him. He was old. He was sick. She had access to him every single day. She could have done anything. She probably poisoned his mind against his own children. She probably forged the whole document. She probably... Veronica seemed to run out of accusations, her voice rising to a pitch that bordered on hysterical, and she looked around the room as if searching for support, for someone to validate her outrage and agree that yes, obviously this was all some elaborate scheme perpetrated by the disabled secretary who had somehow managed to bewitch a successful CEO into leaving her his entire fortune. The accusations were absurd. Marina knew that intellectually, but they still stung because they reflected assumptions that society made constantly about people with disabilities, that they were somehow less trustworthy, more likely to be manipulative or deceptive, using their disability to gain sympathy or advantage. Jennifer remained seated, but her face had gone sheet white, all the color draining out until she looked almost translucent in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Her hands were still pressed to her mouth, but her eyes had gone wide, huge and dark in her pale face. And those eyes were fixed on Marina with an expression that was harder to read than Marcus's rage or Veronica's accusations. Shock, certainly. Profound and complete shock. But also something else. Something that looked like it might be hurt, or might be dawning realization, or might be the beginning of understanding something that she hadn't understood before this moment. Unlike her brother and sister-in-law, Jennifer wasn't immediately attacking, wasn't throwing accusations or demanding explanations. She was just staring at Marina, really looking at her for maybe the first time in 20 years of peripheral contact. And Marina could see Jennifer's mind working behind those wide eyes, trying to process this information, trying to make sense of why their father would have done something so seemingly incomprehensible, trying to find some explanation that would make this make sense. Marina finally found her voice, though it came out shakier and weaker than she wanted. lacking the professional confidence she usually managed to maintain even in difficult situations. "I didn't manipulate anyone. I didn't ask for this. I didn't even know about it until this exact moment. I swear to you, all of you, this is as much of a shock to me as it is to you. I had no idea. None. I wouldn't do something like this. I wouldn't." She trailed off, not sure what else to say, how to convince them of something that even she was struggling to believe. It was true. Every word of it was absolutely true. Thomas had died 3 weeks ago of a sudden massive heart attack at the age of 68. It had been completely unexpected. He'd been healthy, active, working full days right up until the end. Marina had been the one to find him the next morning when she'd arrived at the office early as she always did, letting herself into his private office with the key he'd given her years ago so she could prepare his workspace before he arrived. But instead of an empty office waiting to be prepared, she'd found Thomas slumped over his desk, his head resting on his keyboard, his eyes closed, his skin already cool to the touch. She'd known immediately that he was gone, but she'd still called 911, still performed CPR even though she knew it was futile, still held his hand while she waited for the paramedics to arrive because she couldn't bear the thought of him being alone. The image of that morning was burned into Marina's brain with the kind of clarity that traumatic memories had, every detail sharp and painful. The way the early morning sunlight had streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the office in golden light that made the scene feel surreal, almost peaceful except for the terrible stillness of Thomas's body. The smell of his cologne, subtle and expensive, mixed with the sharp metallic scent that Marina would later learn was common when someone died suddenly. The sound of her own voice on the phone with the 911 operator, surprisingly calm and professional, even though her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. The feeling of Thomas's hand in hers, still warm but growing cooler with each passing minute, and the terrible knowledge that she was too late, that he'd been gone for hours, that nothing she did could bring him back. She had been devastated by his death. She had cried at his funeral, genuine tears streaming down her face as she sat in the back row of the church, because she knew that even after 20 years of working more closely with Thomas than anyone else in his life, she was still just the secretary, still expected to maintain appropriate distance from the family and their grief. She had mourned him not just as a boss, but as a mentor, as the one person who had given her a chance when everyone else had turned her away, as someone who had changed the entire trajectory of her life by seeing past her wheelchair to her potential. But she had never, ever imagined that he thought of her as anything more than a valued employee, and she had certainly never imagined that he would leave her his fortune, his company, his legacy. This was incomprehensible. Richard held up both hands, palms out in a placating gesture, trying to restore some semblance of order to the chaos erupting in his conference room, trying to get control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. His usually calm professional demeanor was showing cracks now, stress evident in the tightness around his eyes and the way his voice had taken on a slightly strained quality. "Please, everyone, if you'll just let me finish reading. There's more." Thomas included a sealed letter to be read aloud at this meeting. He specifically requested that all parties be present to hear it, and he was very insistent that the letter would explain his reasoning. "He told me that he knew his decisions would be shocking and difficult for everyone involved, but that the letter would provide context that would help you understand why he made these choices." Marcus slammed his hand down on the conference table with such force that the solid mahogany actually made a cracking sound, making Marina worry for a moment that he might have damaged either the table or his hand or both. "I don't care what the letter says." His voice was still raised, still furious, but now there was also a quality of desperation underneath the rage, as if he was starting to realize that this might actually be real, that this wasn't a mistake that could be easily corrected. "This will is fraudulent, and I'm going to contest it. I'll tie this up in court for years if I have to." I'll spend every penny of my inheritance, fighting this if that's what it takes. I'll hire the best lawyers in the country. I'll expose her for the manipulative fraud that she obviously is." He pointed at Marina again, his finger jabbing the air aggressively, and Marina noticed that his hand was trembling slightly, whether from rage or adrenaline or some combination of both. She worked for him every single day. She had complete access to him. She could have filled his head with any kind of poison, could have isolated him from his family, could have convinced him that his own children didn't care about him. This is classic undue influence. Any court in the country will see that? Veronica nodded vigorously beside him, her designer handbag forgotten now, hanging from one hand while the other gripped Marcus's arm, as if she needed the physical support, or perhaps as if she was trying to either calm him down or egg him on. It was hard to tell which. Absolutely. This is textbook elder abuse. She took advantage of him. She manipulated a sick old man. Her voice had gone shrill, the careful, cultured tones she usually maintained dissolving under stress into something harsher and less controlled. But Richard had already broken the seal on the envelope that had been paper-clipped to the will, his movements deliberate and careful, treating the document with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred texts or historically significant artifacts. He pulled out several pages of what looked like personal stationery, heavy cream-colored paper with Thomas Chen's name embossed at the top in elegant script, the kind of expensive stationery that successful executives used for personal correspondence. Richard unfolded the pages carefully, smoothing them flat against the table, and then began to read in a voice that was steady and clear, giving appropriate weight to words that Thomas Chen had written in his own hand 6 months before his death. Words that he knew would cause pain and confusion and anger, but that he'd decided needed to be said, needed to be heard, needed to become part of the permanent record. "To my children, Marcus and Jennifer." Richard's voice carried Thomas's words into the silent room. And despite everything, despite the shock and the confusion and the fear, Marina found herself leaning forward slightly in her wheelchair, desperate to hear what Thomas had written, desperate to understand why he had done this incomprehensible thing. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone, and I can only imagine your shock and anger at the distribution of my estate. I understand that you feel betrayed. I understand that you're confused and hurt. I understand that the first thing you probably want to do is hire lawyers and fight this will and try to prove that I wasn't of sound mind when I wrote it. But before you rush to judgment, before you waste years of your lives and millions of dollars in legal fees fighting something that won't change, I need you to understand why I made this decision. And I need you to know a truth that I've kept hidden for far too long. A secret that has shaped more of your lives than you realize. A truth that explains so much about decisions I've made that must have seemed arbitrary or unfair to you over the years." The letter paused there, and Richard looked up briefly, meeting the eyes of everyone in the room as if checking to make sure they were all still with him, still following, still capable of processing what was coming next. Then he continued, his voice perhaps a shade softer now, as if he understood that the words he was about to speak would fundamentally alter how these people understood their own histories, their own families, their own identities. 25 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I had an affair. Your mother Susan and I were going through a very difficult time. She had just miscarried what would have been your younger sister, Jennifer, and the loss devastated her in ways I couldn't fully understand or address. She fell into a deep depression that lasted for months, maybe even longer than that if I'm being honest. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely function. I felt helpless, unable to comfort her, unable to fix what was broken, unable to say or do anything that would ease her pain. I watched the woman I loved suffer, and I had no idea how to help her. And that helplessness made me feel inadequate and frustrated and angry at myself in ways I'd never experienced before. Marcus had sunk back into his chair now, though whether he'd consciously chosen to sit or simply collapsed is unclear. His face was no longer purple with rage, but ashen now, gray and drawn, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had gone white and the leather was creaking under the pressure. His mouth hung slightly open, and for the first time since Marina had known him, Marcus Chen looked genuinely vulnerable, stripped of the arrogant confidence that usually defined him. Jennifer had started crying, silent tears running down her carefully made-up face, tracking black mascara down her cheeks in dark streaks that she didn't seem to notice or care about. She made no sound, didn't sob or gasp, just sat very still while tears rolled down her face. Her brown eyes locked on Richard as he continued to read their father's confession from beyond the grave, revealing sins they'd never known about, exposing secrets that had been carefully hidden for their entire adult lives. Veronica looked like she wanted to interrupt, to stop this, to somehow prevent the words from being spoken. But even she seemed to understand that there was no stopping this now, no way to put this genie back in the bottle. The truth was coming out whether they wanted to hear it or not, whether they were ready for it or not, and all they could do was sit and listen and try to process information that would change everything they thought they knew about their family. And I don't offer any of this as an excuse for what I did, Richard continued reading. Thomas's words blunt and unsparing in their self-condemnation, refusing to let himself off the hook even posthumously. I'm not trying to justify my actions or shift blame to your mother or to circumstances beyond my control. What I did was wrong. It was selfish and stupid and a betrayal of my marriage vows and my commitment to your mother. I'm simply providing context so you can understand, at least a little bit, how a man who loved his wife and cherished his family could do something so profoundly destructive. The letter explained the affair in more detail than was probably necessary or comfortable for anyone to hear. Thomas had met Dr. Marina Chen at a technology conference in San Francisco, a 3-day event where he'd been a keynote speaker and she'd been presenting research on emerging applications of artificial intelligence in healthcare. They'd connected during a panel discussion, had continued talking over coffee, had discovered shared interests and perspectives that made conversation easy and exciting. It had started as intellectual friendship, the kind of connection that was rare and valuable and shouldn't have been anything more than that. But Thomas had been lonely and frustrated and feeling inadequate in his marriage, and Lisa had been brilliant and kind and engaged with his ideas in a way that made him feel seen and valued. And somewhere in those 3 days, friendship had crossed a line into something else. The affair lasted 6 months, Thomas's letter continued. The timeline laid out clearly as if he wanted no ambiguity about the extent of his transgression. We would meet for coffee or dinner when she was in town for work, and once I flew to Los Angeles where she was presenting at another conference. And I told your mother I had business meetings when really I was spending the weekend with Lisa. It was exciting and intoxicating and made me feel young and alive in ways I hadn't felt in years. But it was also a lie, a betrayal, a fundamental violation of everything I claimed to value. And after 6 months, I came to my senses. I realized what I was risking, what I was destroying. I ended things with Lisa. I confessed everything to your mother. It nearly destroyed our marriage, and to this day I don't know if Susan ever truly forgave me or if she simply chose to stay for practical reasons or for your sake. Richard paused to turn to the next page, and Marina noticed that his hands were trembling slightly, making the paper rustle audibly in the silent room. She could only imagine how difficult this must be for him, reading such intimate personal revelations, serving as the messenger for secrets that had been carefully hidden for decades. But he continued, his professional training carrying him through despite the emotional weight of the material. Your mother and I went to counseling. We spent a year in therapy, working through the betrayal, trying to rebuild trust that had been shattered. It was the hardest year of my marriage, harder even than the year after the miscarriage, because at least that grief was something we shared, something that brought us together even in pain. But my affair was something I had done to her, an injury I had inflicted, and healing from that was a much longer and more painful process. Eventually, we found our way back to something that resembled our marriage, though I think we both knew it would never be quite the same as it had been before. And I convinced myself that my moment of weakness was behind me, buried and done. A chapter of my life that was closed and that I never had to think about again. I was wrong. Marina's hands had begun to shake. She gripped the armrests of her wheelchair tighter, her fingers digging into the padding, trying to anchor herself as a terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. A possibility so huge and so incomprehensible that she couldn't fully let herself think it, couldn't fully process what it might mean if it were true. No, this couldn't be going where she thought it was going. This was impossible. Her mother's name had been Dr. Lisa Chen. Her mother had been a researcher at Stanford who later transferred to UCLA. Her mother had worked in artificial intelligence and healthcare applications. Her mother had died when Marina was 18 years old, had never told her who her father was, had always simply said that he wasn't in the picture, that he had his own life, that it was better this way, that Marina didn't need a father because they had each other, and that was enough. Marina had accepted that explanation because she'd loved and trusted her mother completely, had believed that if her mother said it was better not to know, then it must be true. She'd built her identity around being raised by a single mother, around being independent and self-sufficient, around not needing a father figure to validate her or define her worth. She'd convinced herself that it didn't matter, that she was fine without that knowledge, that some questions were better left unasked. But now, sitting in this conference room, listening to Thomas Chen's letter being read aloud, all those carefully constructed narratives were crumbling. And Marina felt like the ground was dissolving beneath her wheelchair, like everything she'd thought she knew about her own life was suddenly suspect. 9 months after the affair ended, Richard continued reading, and Marina felt her heart start to pound so hard it was almost painful, felt her breath coming faster, felt panic rising in her chest. Lisa contacted me. She called my office and asked to meet with me. I almost didn't go. I was terrified that Susan would find out, that this chapter of my life that I thought I'd closed would explode into the present and destroy everything I'd been working to rebuild. But Lisa was insistent. She said it was important. She said it would be the last time we'd ever need to speak. So I agreed to meet her for coffee, at a place far from my office, at a time when I was supposed to be in a meeting so no one would know I was gone. Thomas described that meeting in painful detail, the way Lisa had looked tired and scared and determined all at once, the way she'd ordered coffee she didn't drink, the way she'd struggled to find words for what she needed to say. And then the revelation that had changed everything. The news that Thomas had never anticipated, never prepared for, never wanted to hear. Lisa told me she was pregnant with my child. She told me she'd discovered the pregnancy about a month after we'd ended our relationship, and she'd spent the subsequent months trying to decide what to do. She'd considered terminating the pregnancy. She'd considered not telling me at all, just disappearing and raising the child alone without me ever knowing. But ultimately, she decided that I had a right to know, that this child had a right to exist, and that what happened next should be a decision we made together rather than something she imposed unilaterally. Marina's vision had gone blurry. She realized she was crying, tears streaming down her face silently, her whole body trembling with the force of emotions she couldn't even name. This was real. This was actually happening. Thomas Chen, the man she had worked for, admired, and cared for deeply for 20 years, was her father, her biological father, the father she'd never known, never been able to imagine, and now would never be able to meet as his daughter because he was gone, dead 3 weeks ago, taking with him any chance for Marina to have the conversation she hadn't even known she needed to have. I was terrified. Thomas's letter continued, his fear palpable even through Richard's professional narration. I had just spent a year trying to rebuild my marriage after nearly destroying it with my infidelity. I had 2 children who I loved desperately and who deserved better from me than another devastating revelation about their father's failures. I had a company to run and a reputation to maintain. The thought of Susan finding out that not only had I had an affair, but that the affair had resulted in a pregnancy, a child, felt like it would destroy everything I'd been fighting to save. So I made a choice that I've regretted every single day for the past 25 years. What Thomas did next was lay out in stark, uncomfortable detail. He had given Lisa money, a substantial sum, $200,000 in cash that he'd withdrawn from various accounts in amounts small enough not to trigger any reporting requirements or questions from their accountant. He'd told Lisa that this money was to ensure she and the baby would be financially secure, that she wouldn't have to worry about how to support a child on a researcher's salary. But the money came with conditions. Lisa would never contact him again. She would never tell the child who the father was. She would never make any claims on Thomas's estate or resources beyond that initial payment. And in exchange for her silence, Thomas would walk away and never look back, never check on the child, never try to be part of its life in any way. Lisa agreed to my terms, Thomas wrote, the shame evident in every word. She took the money. She promised never to contact me again, and then she left, and I convinced myself that I had handled the situation as well as it could be handled, that I was protecting my family, protecting my marriage, protecting my children from the fallout of my mistakes. But I was lying to myself. I wasn't protecting anyone. I was protecting myself from the consequences of my actions, from the discomfort of confession, from the responsibility of fatherhood to this child I would never know. I was choosing the easy path over the right path. I was being a coward. The letter shifted forward in time then, jumping ahead 18 years to the day that everything changed, the day when Thomas's past and present collided in a way he'd never anticipated. Richard's voice remained steady as he read, but Marina could hear the emotional weight building in the narrative, could sense that they were approaching the heart of this confession, the revelation that would explain everything else. 18 years later, a young woman named Marina Chen applied for an executive secretary position at my company. I saw her name on the application, and I felt my stomach drop. Chen wasn't an uncommon surname, I told myself. It was probably just a coincidence. There were thousands of Chens in California. There was no reason to think this had anything to do with Lisa, with the affair I'd had 25 years ago, with the daughter I'd chosen not to know. But when I looked at the full application and saw her mother's name listed as Dr. Lisa Chen, deceased, I knew this was my daughter, my biological daughter. The child I had abandoned before she was even born, the daughter I had paid to never know, standing metaphorically at my door, asking for a job, completely unaware of who I was or what connection we shared. Marcus made a strangled sound, something between a laugh and a sob, a sound of complete disbelief and dawning horror. Jennifer's crying had become more audible now. Quiet sobs shaking her shoulders, her hands still pressed to her mouth as if she could somehow hold back the grief and shock and confusion that were overwhelming her. Veronica looked like she might be sick, her hand pressed to her stomach, her face gone pale beneath her perfect makeup. And Marina just sat there, frozen in her wheelchair, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but listen, as her entire understanding of her own life was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into something completely different. Thomas Chen was her father, the man who had hired her 20 years ago, who had given her the chance that no one else would give her, who had been her boss and her mentor and the person she'd spent more waking hours with than anyone else in her adult life. That man was her father. And he'd known. He'd known from the very first day. He'd known when he interviewed her, when he hired her, when he trained her, when he worked beside her for 2 decades. He'd known, and he'd never said a word. The letter continued, and Thomas described reading Marina's application with shaking hands, learning about her accident at 16 that had left her paralyzed, reading her essay about overcoming obstacles and refusing to let her disability define her limitations. He learned that she'd put herself through community college and then UC Berkeley with a combination of scholarships, student loans, and part-time work. He learned that her grades were excellent, Her recommendations from professors and previous employers were glowing, and that she'd applied to 50 different companies before Chen Technologies, getting rejection after rejection once employers realized she used a wheelchair. She had overcome obstacles that would have destroyed most people, Thomas wrote, his pride evident even through the medium of Richard's neutral narration. She had built a life for herself through sheer determination and intelligence, and refusal to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on her. And she had done it all without any help from me, without even knowing who I was, without any support beyond the money I'd given her mother before she was born. Money that I later learned Lisa had put into a trust for Marina's education, refusing to spend a penny of it on herself, using her own salary to support them both throughout Marina's childhood. Lisa had been a better parent alone than I could have been if I'd been present, and Marina had become an extraordinary young woman despite my absence, or perhaps because of it. Thomas described the decision to hire Marina, explaining that he'd overruled objections from several members of his executive team who worried about how a secretary in a wheelchair would manage the physical demands of the position, how she'd navigate the building, how clients and partners might react. He'd told them Chen Technologies was an equal opportunity employer and that Marina deserved a fair chance to prove herself. But Thomas admitted in his letter that his motivations were more complex than simple commitment to equal opportunity employment. I hired her because she was my daughter, even though she didn't know it. I hired her because I wanted the chance to know her, to see what kind of person she'd become, to somehow make up for abandoning her by being present in her life, even if I couldn't tell her the truth about our relationship. I hired her because I was curious and guilty and desperate to have some connection to this child I'd never known, and I told myself I was doing it for noble reasons, to give her an opportunity, to make up for my past failures, but really I was doing it for myself, to ease my own guilt, to feel like maybe I wasn't completely irredeemable as a father. What happened next, Thomas explained, exceeded his wildest expectations and simultaneously deepened his guilt exponentially. Marina proved every single skeptic wrong within the first month. She reorganized his entire filing system, making it more efficient and accessible, creating a structure that made information easier to find and reduced wasted time searching for documents. She learned the company's computer systems and software faster than any secretary he'd ever had, mastering programs in days that usually took weeks for new employees to understand. She developed a comprehensive system for managing his schedule that accounted for his working style, his energy patterns throughout the day, his preferences for different types of meetings, creating a flow that made him more productive than he'd been in years. She handled difficult clients with a combination of professionalism and warmth that impressed everyone who interacted with her, diffusing angry callers with empathy and patience, charming demanding partners with efficiency and competence. She managed complex logistics for board meetings and investor presentations, coordinating with dozens of people across multiple time zones, ensuring that every detail was perfect, that every participant had what they needed, that nothing was overlooked or forgotten. She took initiative, anticipating needs before Thomas had to articulate them, solving problems before they escalated into crises, becoming so integral to his daily functioning that he didn't know how he'd manage before she arrived. She became absolutely indispensable to me, Thomas wrote, not because she was my daughter, though she was, but because she was brilliant at her job. She had a gift for organization, for seeing patterns and systems, for understanding what needed to happen next. She was efficient but not cold, professional but not distant, competent but not arrogant. She made my work life better in every measurable way, and she did it all while facing obstacles and prejudices that I only gradually began to understand. Thomas described watching Marina navigate a world that wasn't built for people in wheelchairs, seeing her struggle with doors that were too heavy, elevators that were too crowded, conference rooms where the table configurations made it difficult for her to position her wheelchair effectively. He watched colleagues treat her as if she were invisible, talking over her or around her as if her disability somehow meant she wasn't really present. He watched clients do double takes when they met her, saw their discomfort, saw them direct questions to him that Marina could have answered better. He watched other executives treat her as if she were less competent simply because she couldn't walk, dismissing her ideas or suggestions without consideration. I watched her handle all of this with dignity and grace that humbled me, Thomas wrote. She never complained, never made her challenges other people's problems, never used her disability as an excuse or an explanation. She just worked harder than everyone else, proved herself over and over again, earned respect through sheer competence even from people who'd been predisposed to dismiss her. She stayed late countless nights to help me prepare for crucial meetings, working past midnight to ensure every detail was perfect. She took work home on weekends during busy periods, answering emails and calls at all hours because she cared about the work and wanted to do it right. She used her own vacation time once when I was sick to come in and manage the office because she knew how much I needed her and didn't want me to have to worry about things falling apart. Thomas contrasted Marina's dedication with his own children's approach to work and life. Marcus ran divisions of the company incompetently, making rash decisions, ignoring advice from experienced managers, treating subordinates with contempt, and expecting his father to bail him out every time he failed. Jennifer spent her time planning charity galas and sitting on boards where she contributed nothing except her name and her checkbook, taking credit for other people's work while never building or creating anything herself. Both of them had been given every opportunity, every advantage, every form of support that wealth and privilege could provide, and neither of them had developed the work ethic, integrity, or genuine competence that Marina had developed despite facing obstacles they couldn't imagine. For 20 years, Richard read, his voice carrying Thomas's words into the silent, shocked room, I watched my daughter build a life for herself with no help from me beyond a paycheck and the occasional compliment. I watched her face discrimination and ableism from colleagues who treated her like she was invisible or incompetent simply because she used a wheelchair. I watched her prove them wrong, over and over again, never losing her professionalism or her kindness, even when people didn't deserve it. I watched her work twice as hard as everyone else for half the recognition. I watched her celebrate other people's successes, even when she'd done most of the work to make those successes possible. I watched her live with integrity and purpose and strength that shamed me every single day. And through it all, for 20 years, I never told her the truth. I never said the words that should have been said 25 years ago when Lisa first told me she was pregnant. I'm your father. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm proud of you. Marina was openly crying now, no longer trying to hide her tears or maintain any pretense of professional composure. Her whole body shook with sobs, her face buried in her hands, grief and shock and anger and relief and confusion all tangled together into an emotional storm too powerful to contain. 20 years. 20 years she'd sat outside Thomas Chen's office, managing his schedule, organizing his life, working beside him every single day, and he'd been her father. Her father who'd abandoned her before she was born. Her father who'd watched her struggle and succeed without ever claiming her. Her father who'd died 3 weeks ago, taking with him any chance for Marina to have the conversation they should have had 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, or at her birth. The letter was winding toward its conclusion now, and Thomas's final words were both an explanation for his decisions and an apology for his failures. A justification for the will that had shocked everyone, and a plea for understanding from the family he was leaving behind. I told myself I was protecting her, Richard read, Thomas's guilt evident in every sentence. I told myself that she was better off not knowing, that revealing the truth would only complicate her life, that she'd built her identity and her independence without me, and that claiming her as my daughter would somehow diminish what she'd accomplished on her own. But I was lying to myself. I was protecting myself, not her. I was a coward when I gave her mother money and walked away 25 years ago. And I remained a coward, day after day, year after year, for 20 years, watching my daughter work 10 feet away from me and never having the courage to tell her who I was, never having the strength to face her potential anger or rejection or confusion. Thomas's letter then addressed Marcus and Jennifer directly, and his words became even more difficult, even more unsparing in their honesty. Marcus, Jennifer, I love you both. You are my children, and nothing can change that. But I have failed you as a father in ways that go far beyond keeping this secret from you. I gave you everything: money, opportunities, education, social position, professional connections, every advantage that wealth could provide. But in giving you everything, I also gave you a sense of entitlement that has made you less than you could have been. I enabled you to believe that your last name entitled you to success without effort, to respect without earning it, to positions of authority without developing the competence those positions required. Marcus looked like he'd been physically struck, his face crumpling, all the fury draining out to be replaced by something that looked like devastation. These weren't just words from his father. These were his father's final words, his lasting judgment, the assessment that would define how Marcus understood their relationship for the rest of his life. There would be no chance to argue, to defend himself, to prove his father wrong. Thomas was gone, and these harsh truths were his legacy. Marcus, you run divisions of my company, but you run them poorly. You make rash decisions based on ego rather than data. You ignore advice from managers who have decades more experience than you. You treat your subordinates with contempt, creating hostile work environments that drive talented people away. You take credit for successes that were team efforts and blame others for failures that were your responsibility. And every time you fail, every time your division underperforms or a major project goes over budget or a key client leaves because of your mismanagement, you come to me expecting me to fix it, to smooth things over, to protect you from the consequences of your poor judgment. And I've done that, over and over again, because you're my son and I love you, and I wanted to believe you would eventually learn and grow. But you haven't learned. You've just gotten better at expecting to be bailed out. And that's my failure as much as yours. I enabled this. I made you believe that failure had no real consequences, that your position would always protect you, that you'd never actually have to be good at your job because I'd always be there to save you. Jennifer's crying intensified, her sobs now audible and raw, her shoulders shaking violently. Her father's words were cutting deep, exposing truths she'd probably suspected but never had to confront so directly. Jennifer, you're kinder than your brother, and I've always appreciated that about you. But kindness without purpose, without the willingness to actually do difficult work or make meaningful contributions, is ultimately empty. You spend your life planning charity galas where you take credit for the efforts of event coordinators you hire. You sit on boards where you contribute nothing except your name and your father's money. You chair committees where other people do all the actual work while you show up for photo opportunities and speeches written by someone else. You've never built anything. You've never created anything. You've never accomplished anything that wasn't handed to you by virtue of being my daughter. And that's my fault. I made you believe that your role in life was to look beautiful and gracious, to marry well, to serve as a decorative figurehead for charitable causes. I should have expected more from you. I should have demanded that you develop your own capabilities, find your own purpose, build something meaningful with the advantages you were given. Thomas's words laid out the stark contrast between his biological children and his secret daughter, between Marcus and Jennifer, who had been given everything and squandered it, and Marina, who had been given nothing and built a life of purpose and integrity anyway. Marina had never asked him for anything beyond fair pay for excellent work. She had stayed late countless nights, not because he demanded it, but because she cared about the quality of her work and wanted to ensure things were done right. She had taken work home on weekends during crucial periods, using her own personal time to ensure projects succeeded. She had used her own vacation time once when Thomas was sick to cover for him at the office, knowing he wouldn't be able to rest unless he was confident things were under control. She faced obstacles every single day that you've never had to consider, Thomas wrote. His words an indictment of the privilege his biological children had enjoyed without appreciation, navigating a world that wasn't built for people in wheelchairs, dealing with people who dismissed her or patronized her or treated her as less than human simply because she couldn't walk, fighting for respect and recognition in a corporate culture that often treats women as inferior and people with disabilities as incapable, proving herself over and over again to people who had already decided she didn't belong. And she did all of this with grace and strength and dignity that I could only admire from a distance, from my position of cowardice where I watched her struggle, but never acknowledged that I was her father, that I owed her more than just a salary and occasional encouragement. The letter moved toward its final justification. Thomas's explanation for why he had structured his will the way he had, why Marina was receiving 70% while Marcus and Jennifer received only 10% each. This is why I've made the decisions I've made regarding my estate. Marcus, Jennifer, you're receiving 10% each, which amounts to $35 million apiece plus valuable properties. That's more money than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. It's enough to live comfortably for the rest of your lives if you manage it responsibly. It's enough to pursue any interest, to start any business, to build something meaningful if you choose to do so. But it's not enough to simply coast on without ever having to work or grow or change or develop yourselves into people of substance. I hope you'll use this as an opportunity rather than a punishment. I hope you'll prove me wrong about the people you've become. I hope you'll build lives of purpose and contribution instead of just privilege and consumption. Marina is receiving 70% of my estate, including controlling interest in Chen Technologies, because she's earned it. Not just by being my daughter, though she is my daughter, and I'm proud of that even though I never had the courage to tell her so. She's earned it by being the kind of person I wish I'd been, by working with integrity and dedication for 20 years, by proving that disability is not inability, by being loyal and kind and strong in ways that expose my own weakness and cowardice. She's earned it by being everything I should have taught Marcus and Jennifer to be but didn't. She's earned it by building a life of meaning despite my abandonment, despite facing obstacles they've never known, despite having every reason to be bitter and angry, but choosing instead to be competent and compassionate. Richard was nearing the final paragraphs now, his voice slightly hoarse from reading for so long, his professional composure showing cracks as the emotional weight of Thomas's confession took its toll even on someone trained to maintain distance from the material he was presenting. Marina, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't there when your mother was pregnant, when she was scared and alone and trying to figure out how to raise a child by herself. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you were born, when you took your first steps, when you said your first words, when you had your first day of school. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you had your accident at 16, when you spent 2 years in rehabilitation learning to navigate the world from a wheelchair, when you were applying to colleges and wondering if any of them would see past your disability to your potential. I'm sorry I wasn't there when your mother died and you were 18 years old and suddenly completely alone in the world. I'm sorry I watched you work beside me for 20 years, watched you struggle and succeed and build a life of purpose, and never once acknowledged that you were my daughter, that you deserved more from me than just a paycheck and the occasional compliment on your work. Marina was beyond tears now, past the point where crying provided any relief or release. She just sat very still in her wheelchair, numb and overwhelmed, trying to process information that felt too large to hold in her mind all at once. Her father, Thomas Chen, had been her father. The revelation changed everything and nothing simultaneously. It explained so much: why he'd hired her when no one else would, why he'd always been so patient with her, why he'd gone out of his way to ensure she had opportunities to prove herself, why he'd defended her to other executives who questioned her capabilities. But it also raised 1,000 questions that would now never be answered. Why hadn't he told her? What had he thought when he looked at her every day? Had he wanted to claim her as his daughter? Had he been ashamed of her? Had he been protecting her or protecting himself? I was a coward, Richard continued reading, Thomas's final words pulling no punches, offering no excuses, accepting full responsibility for his failures. I remained a coward until the moment I wrote this letter. And even now I'm taking the easy way out, telling you the truth only after I'm gone, so I don't have to face your reaction, your anger, your hurt, your disappointment. I don't have to see the look in your eyes when you realize that the man you worked for, respected, maybe even cared about, was actually your father who abandoned you before you were born and then never had the courage to claim you even when he had the chance. I don't have to answer your questions or explain myself or try to justify the unjustifiable. I get to be dead and leave you with this information and all the complicated feelings that come with it. And that's cowardly too. But it's all I have left to give you. The truth, however incomplete and however late. The acknowledgement that you are my daughter and I am proud of you, even if I never earned the right to say so. Thomas's letter concluded with words for all three of his children, an attempt to bridge the impossible gap he'd created, to somehow make this devastating revelation into something that could lead to connection, rather than just more pain and division. Marina, I can't give you back the years I stole from you by my silence and my cowardice, but I can give you the security, the opportunity, and the recognition you've always deserved. You are my daughter. You're the person I'm most proud of in this world. The company is yours. Do with it what you will. I know you'll run it with integrity and vision and compassion, qualities you developed despite my absence rather than because of anything I taught you. I know you'll do far better than I ever did. You've been proving that every day for 20 years. I just wish I'd had the courage to tell you while I was alive, to be your father in truth rather than just in biology. And to Marcus and Jennifer. Richard read the final paragraph, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer completely suppress. Awai, I hope you can forgive me someday for the secrets I kept and the lies I told by omission. I hope you can learn from my mistakes rather than repeating them. I hope you can learn to see Marina not as someone who took something from you, but as the sister you never knew you had. She didn't ask for this. She didn't scheme or manipulate or plan any of this. She just worked hard and lived with integrity. Exactly the kind of person I wish I'd raised you both to be. If you're angry, be angry at me, not at her. I'm the one who created this situation. I'm the one who made choices that hurt all of you. I'm the one who failed as a father to all three of my children in different ways. And I'm sorry. I'm deeply, profoundly, completely sorry. I hope all three of my children can someday find peace with the complicated legacy I'm leaving behind. I hope you can find your way to being a family, even though I failed to make that possible while I was alive. And I hope you can all forgive me, though I'm not sure I deserve it. With all my love and all my regret, Thomas Chen. Richard carefully folded the letter and set it down on the table, his hands trembling slightly now that the ordeal of reading was over. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, looking suddenly older and more tired than he had at the beginning of this meeting. The silence that followed was even more profound than all the previous silences, weighted with revelation and grief and shock and the terrible knowledge that everything everyone in this room had believed about their family, their history, their identities, was now fundamentally changed. Nobody spoke for a long time. Minutes passed, marked only by the quiet sound of Jennifer's crying and the faint hum of the building around them. Marina sat frozen in her wheelchair, her face wet with tears, her mind unable to fully process what she'd just learned. Marcus remained collapsed in his chair, all the fight drained out of him, staring at the table as if answers might appear in the wood grain if he looked long enough. Veronica stood slightly apart, clearly uncertain what role she was supposed to play now that the situation had evolved so far beyond anything she could have anticipated. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice completely different from before. All the fury and bluster gone, replaced by something that sounded almost broken, almost childlike in its vulnerability. She didn't know. He looked up at Marina, really looked at her for perhaps the first time in 20 years, seeing her as a person rather than just an inconvenient presence in his father's office. You really didn't know, did you? All these years, 20 years working for him, sitting outside his office every single day, and you had no idea he was your father. It wasn't really a question, but Marina answered anyway, her voice hoarse from crying, barely more than a whisper. No, I swear to you, I had no idea. My mother never told me who my father was. When she died, I thought that secret died with her. I thought I'd never know. I made peace with that. Or I thought I had. I built my own life. I got my degree. I applied for jobs. I got hired here. That's all. I just worked. That's all I ever did. I worked hard and tried to prove myself and tried to be good at my job. I never knew. I never suspected. How could I have? There was nothing in his behavior, nothing he said or did, that would have made me think he was anything more than my boss. A good boss, a mentor even, but just my boss. I never imagined. Her voice broke, and she couldn't continue. Jennifer was staring at Marina now, really staring, her red-rimmed eyes taking in details she'd never noticed before, despite seeing Marina around the building for 2 decades. You have his eyes, she said suddenly, her voice thick with tears and revelation. Oh my God, you have our father's eyes. How did I never see it before? They're the exact same shade of brown, the same shape, and your chin. You have his chin. The family resemblance is actually obvious now that I'm looking for it. How did none of us ever notice? Because people saw what they expected to see, Marina thought, but didn't say. Because she was the secretary in the wheelchair, and that's all most people saw when they looked at her. They saw the chair, saw her position, saw the professional distance that was supposed to exist between executives and administrative staff, and they never looked closely enough to see anything else. And Thomas had never given them reason to look closer, had never acknowledged Marina as anything other than an exceptionally competent employee, had maintained the fiction so completely that no one had ever questioned it. Marcus slowly stood up, his movements deliberate and careful, and walked around the table toward Marina. For a moment, she tensed, uncertain what he was going to do, half expecting more anger or accusations. But when he reached her, he just stood there, looking down at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Something vulnerable and confused and maybe even apologetic. I'm sorry, he said finally, the words seeming to cost him significant effort. I'm sorry for how I treated you all these years, for every time I dismissed you or talked down to you or made you feel like you weren't worthy of being here, for arguing against your hiring in the first place, for 20 years of treating you like you were invisible or incompetent just because you use a wheelchair. That was wrong. I was wrong. And I'm sorry. He paused, swallowing hard. I don't know if I'm ready to think of you as my sister yet. This is all too new, too shocking. But I believe you that you didn't know, that you didn't manipulate him or scheme for any of this. My father, our father, he was the one who created this situation. He was the one who kept secrets and made choices that hurt all of us. You're just trying to make sense of it like the rest of us. Marina managed a weak nod, not trusting herself to speak. Jennifer stood up as well and walked over, hesitating for just a moment before reaching out and taking Marina's hand, squeezing it gently. I don't know you, she said, her voice still thick with emotion. I've seen you around for years, but I never really looked at you, never tried to know you. I'm ashamed of that, for what our father did to you, for how Marcus and I treated you all these years like you were just part of the furniture, for everything. I don't know if I'm ready to call you my sister yet either, but I'm willing to try to understand. I'm willing to try to build something, whatever that might be. That's something, isn't it? It was something. It was more than Marina had any right to expect, given the circumstances. She looked at Jennifer's hand holding hers, at Marcus standing nearby with an expression that wasn't quite acceptance but wasn't hostility either, and felt the tiniest spark of hope amid all the grief and confusion and shock. Maybe something good could come from this disaster after all. Maybe Thomas Chen's final act, revealing the truth he'd hidden for so long, could somehow lead to connection rather than just more division. Maybe these three people, thrown together by secrets and revelation and a complicated inheritance, could find their way to being something resembling a family, even if that family would always be marked by the absence of the man who should have brought them together decades ago. What did you think of Marina's incredible journey? From secretary to CEO, from hidden daughter to respected leader, from being dismissed because of her wheelchair to proving that disability has nothing to do with capability. Marina's story shows us that family secrets always have consequences, that true character is proven through adversity, and that the people we overlook are sometimes the ones who deserve our attention most. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. How would you have handled discovering the truth about your father after 20 years? Do you think Thomas Chen did the right thing leaving the company to Marina? And what would you say to Marcus if you could? Share your story. Your experience might help someone else who's dealing with complicated family legacies or fighting to be seen for who they really are. Now, rate this story from 0 to 10. Let me know what you thought. Was it the powerful journey of truth and redemption you were hoping for? And if you believe that everyone deserves respect regardless of their circumstances, that hard work and loyalty should be rewarded, and that the truth always matters even when it's complicated, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have more incredible true stories coming your way every week. Thank you so much for watching Marina's story. Remember, if you're facing discrimination because of a disability, because of your background, or because people can't see past their prejudices, don't give up. Your worth isn't determined by what others think of you. It's determined by your character, your work ethic, and your refusal to accept limitations that others try to impose on you. Keep pushing forward. Keep proving them wrong. Your moment will come. Until next time, this is Deep Stories, where every story reminds us that courage, dignity, and perseverance can overcome even the deepest injustice. See you in the next one.